This is Cynthia Ganga with Cynthia Sings Classical, reading from the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, Volume 1, Canada's Residential Schools, The History, Part 1, Origins to 1939. I am on page 11, Empire and Colonialism. Now, when I moved the camera yesterday, it didn't work very well at all. So I hope that you are able to afford, I think the book is $40 from the McGill Press and Queen's Press. I will have that on the website and the link on the information for when I write out about the book, the information from the recording, and we will start. Empire and colonialism. The word empire has its origin in the Latin imperium, which originally meant the right to wage war and to make and execute laws. Over time, the word came to refer to lands far distant from Rome, over which the Romans had extended their military and political authority. The Roman Empire was formed through military conquests that allowed imperial officials to exploit conquered lands. This expansion was justified by the claim that the empire was spreading a universal law for humankind, that to be incorporated into the empire was to make the journey from barbarism to civilization. In this way, the Romans provided future emperors with a model for imperial expansion and a language with which to legitimize their actions. Each European empire gathered together a set of colonies, usually by force or the threat of force, into an unequal political union. The imperial homeland dominated and exploited the colonies. The classic European empires were usually ethnically and religiously diverse and geographically extensive, at times spanning several continents. They were maintained by both the threat of violence and the collaboration of some of the local elites. The term imperialism and colonialism are closely bound together, and the words often are used interchangeably. Imperialism can be said to define the policy of acquiring and maintaining an empire, while colonialism refers to the practices involved in the transforming of the acquired territories into colonies, most commonly by transferring settlers from the imperial power to the colony. Imperialism is not a solely European practice. China, Japan, and the Ottoman Empire, for example, all placed assimilationist pressures on the people who lived within these increasingly centralized states. Europeans did not reserve colonial exclusivity for non-Europeans. The process was in many ways an extension of domestic policies through which the modern European states were created. In this process, for example, in Britain, the Cornish, Welsh, and Gaelic languages were marginalized. The First World War was preceded by a ferocious and often violent competition between the European powers to secure foreign colonies, particularly Africa, and the Second World War was driven in large measure by German ambitions to create a European empire. It has sometimes been argued that empires establish law and order and maintain lengthy periods of peace, but the ideas of a Pax Romana or Pax Britannia, extended eras of peace established under the benevolent rule of the Roman or Briton empires, is largely a myth, the product of imperial self-promotion. Empires were established militarily and engaged in extensive and violent wars with one another, maintained a military presence on their frontiers, and conducted innumerable military campaigns to put down nationalist uprisings. To cite only a few examples, from the history of the British Empire, as many as 10,000 Sinhalese died as a result of the British campaign of destruction and starvation following a revolt in Sri Lanka in 1817. 2 wars were fought to keep the British campaign of destruction and starvation followed a revolt in Sri Lanka in 1817. 2 wars were fought to keep the Chinese market open to opium that the British were producing in India. The repression of the Indian Mutiny left thousands dead, and British gunships were used around the globe to advance British interests. At various times, troops under British control saw duty in the Persian Gulf, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Egypt, Burma, Nyasaland, the Sudan, and Canada. By the early 19th century, under the protection of the British Navy, the British Empire was established in West, South, and East Africa, India, Ceylon, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, and the Caribbean and Canada. Colonies were established to be exploited economically. Benefits could come directly in the form of tax revenues, precious metals, or raw materials for industries in the homeland. Colonies often were required to purchase their imports solely from the homeland, making them a captive market. New forms of economic activity in Europe had fostered a new type of business person, the entrepreneur, with surplus capital in search of an investment opportunity. Colonies provided them with the opportunities they sought. Exploiting these conditions usually involved the expropriation or marginalization of indigenous labor. The benefits of empire went largely to the imperial power rather than to the conquered nation. Profits were not retained in the colony. And spending on education and social welfare was kept to a minimum needed to maintain social order. In a colony, the fundamental decision about the lives of the colonized were made by representatives of the empire who were implementing policies that had been created in the imperial center for the benefits of imperial power. These are Canadian examples of this process. For example, throughout most of the history, the Yukon and Northwest Territories have been internal colonies ruled by and appointed administrators living in Ottawa. There is no single colonial model. In some cases, the colonies was run by a chartered company. In others, the colonizing state ruled directly. In yet others, local leaders were recruited to lead local government, in which could be called colonies of occupation. Imperialists sought to exploit natural resources using indigenous labor. The number of colonists was limited, usually only little more than the military and the personnel needed to control and exploit the colony. After their term of service had expired, often the colonists returned to the homeland. In India, for example, the British presence did not exceed 10,000 in a colony of 400 million. When many of these empires collapsed in the 1940s and 50s, the colonized people proclaimed their sovereignty, while most of the remaining colonists left. These colonies of occupation can be contrasted to settler colonies such as in Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. Although these colonies might have been initiated with the intention to simply exploit resources, over time the focus shifted to large-scale permanent migration of agricultural settlers. From 1830 to 1840, for example, European immigration to North America rose by 40%. Between 1815 and 1912, 2.5 million people emigrated from the British Isles. So extensive was this migration that by 1900, only a third of the English-speaking people in the world lived in Europe. These immigrants frequently were driven by famine, religious, or ethnic persecution, and the changes brought about by the mechanization of agriculture and manufacturing. The increase in the number of colonies was often matched by dramatic decreases in indigenous populations. The Maori population dropped from 80,000 in 1842 to 40,000 in 1896. The population of the Belgian Congo dropped by over 9 million people in the wake of colonization. In North America, the population decline began upon contact and continued throughout the 20th century. Estimates of the rate of population decline for North America ranged from 53% for some groups to 95% for others. New and deadly diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza dramatically reduced indigenous populations. Colonialism had rendered indigenous people especially vulnerable to epidemics by disrupting their relationship to the environment. The poor living and working conditions, also often associated with colonialism, not only left people prey to epidemics, but it also made it far more difficult for indigenous populations to recover from an epidemic. The reception that colonialists received from indigenous peoples varied according to the time and place, depending on respective interests and needs. The variables, including the level of indigenous interest in European trade goods and the colonists' need for indigenous support and assistance for their very survival. The potential existed for cooperation and exchange. In comparing the French and English in North America, one group of Iroquois observed that in 1754, that if one were to look at the forts established by the French, you will see that the land beneath his walls is still hunting ground. Having fixed himself in those places we frequent only to supply our wants, while the English, on the contrary, no sooner get possession of a country than the game is forced to leave it. The trees fall down before them, the earth becomes bare, and we find among them hardly wherewithal to shelter us when the night falls. The statement highlights the reasons not only for cooperating with the French, but also for resisting the English. Conflict and resistance were common throughout the history of imperialism. Resistance could come from the indigenous peoples. In 1577, when British explorer Martin Frobisher tried to take two Inuit hostages on Kwiktuk, Baffin Island, the Inuit fought back, leaving Frobisher with an arrow wound in the buttocks. 200 years later, in 1788, when British captain Arthur Phillipps landed in Botany Bay in Australia, he was greeted by Aboriginal people chanting Wara Wara, which can be translated to go away. An elder on Vancouver Island told colonial official Gilbert Sprout that we do not want the white man. He steals what we have. We wish to live as we are. In other cases, the indigenous people questioned the colonizers' claim to the land. First Nations leaders in the Nass River of British Columbia told the Government Commission in 1887, "What we don't like about the government is their saying this, we will give you this much land. How can they give it to us when it is our own? We cannot understand it. They have never bought it from us or from our fathers." Resistance also came from the people who had been dragged away from their homeland, slaves on the British Isle of Trinidad, in preparation for the result, saying that the bread we eat is the white man's flesh, the wine we drink is the white man's blood. And as the American War of Independence demonstrated, even they themselves, even Even settlers themselves could rebel, particularly if imperial policy attempted to curb the rate and speed at which they took the land of indigenous people. Indigenous resistance conditioned after colonization, taking such varied forms as guerrilla warfare, strikes, and even refusal to assimilate. Such a refusal did not mean that colonized people rejected every aspect of colonial society, particularly if they were able to control the pace of change. In Canada, for example, Aboriginal people valued many of the goods they received through the fur trade and were able to exploit their position as the suppliers of furs to their economic benefit. In settler colonies, the mere presence of indigenous people blocked settlers across blocked settler access to the land. Herman Merivale, a future British permanent Secretary of the Colonial Office, noted in his 1840 Lectures on Colonization and Colonies that there were 4 basic approaches in imperial power could take in its relations with indigenous people. It could exterminate them, enslave them, separate them from colonial society, or assimilate them into colonial society. At one point or another, just about every colonial power experimented with each of these alternatives. People who made their livings as hunters, fishers, and herders, who held land communally, or who lacked a strong and protective state, were marginalized economically and socially. To accommodate settlers, indigenous people were separated from their land and the source of their livelihood. Settlers felled forests, overfished rivers, and fenced and plowed plains, effectively disrupting the economic base and inserting dominion over the land of indigenous peoples around the world. To separate indigenous people from land, settler colonialism negotiated treaties where possible, waged wars of extinction, eliminated traditional landholding practices, disrupted families, and imposed new political and spiritual order that came complete with new values and cultural practices. The outcome was usually disastrous for indigenous people. While the chief beneficiaries of empire may well have been colonists in the settler colonies and their descendants, many of the colonies they settled grew to be among the most prosperous societies in the late 19th and early 20th century world. Settler colonies often went on to achieve political independence. In the case of Canada and the United States of America, these newly created nations spread across North America, creating land-based empires and continuing to colonize indigenous peoples. Settler colonialism remains an ongoing process, shaping both the structure and the quality of the relationship between the settlers and indigenous people. Page 15, Colonialism in the Age of Empire, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Day 4, we will read The Doctrine of Discovery. This is Cynthia Ganga, Cynthia Sings Classical, reading the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, Canada's Residential Schools, Volume 1, The History, Part 1, Origins to 1939.